Ah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm George Dare, the Clerk of the Health and Wellbeing Board. The first item on the agenda today is apologies, and there are apologies from John Selgren, Chief Constable Scott Chilton, and Mark House. The next item on the agenda is the election of chairman. Are there any nominations for chairman?
Thank you very much, George. I'd like to nominate Peter Wharf for the chairmanship of the Health and Wellbeing Board. And when I do that, can I just thank Rebecca for the work she put in the previous 3 years in that role. And so I'm very happy to propose Peter Wharf. I believe there is a seconder.
Thank you, George. I'd be very happy to second the nomination for Peter Wharf to be the chairman.
Thank you. Are there any other nominations? No, in that case, congratulations, Councillor Wharf. You're the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board.
Thank you, George, for your congratulations. Slightly preemptively early, but I'm very grateful for them. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to see you all. Can I add my thanks to the excellent work that Rebecca Knox did in chairing this forum for the last 3 years. We're extremely grateful. Can I depart from the agenda immediately because we didn't have on it the election of a vice chair? Now, can I just check, is Forbes Watson here? I don't think he is. I don't think there's anything against the protocol that prevents us from electing a vice chair who isn't present. He is a member, and he has indicated, as far as I'm aware, that he's happy to continue, and we would very much like that. So can I arbitrarily change the agenda, nominate Forbes Watson? May I have a seconder for Forbes Watson to be vice chair? I'm going to start all of that again because Forbes has just entered the room. Forbes, can you hear me?
I can. Apologies for being a little bit late. I was on different links, shall we say.
These, at least it's slightly different from you're on mute. Can I thank you for coming on board? In the first 2 minutes of the meeting whilst you were not here, A, we thanked Rebecca for the work she's done, and B, I, Peter Wharf, Deputy Leader of Dorset Council, was elected as the Chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board. I was very keen that you would continue in your role as Vice Chair, and I said I was changing the agenda to add this item on, assuming that you would be happy to continue, which, as far as I'm concerned, I was aware you were, and I'd be very keen to work with you in that role. Are you prepared to accept the nomination of Vice Chair, Forbes? You're on mute.
Yeah, as I responded to Matt, I am happy to continue, but obviously my role is changing with the CCG finishing within the next week. So it's I'm very happy to support it for today's meeting, but I think there's a conversation probably between health and care, but certainly within health as to membership of the Health and Wellbeing Board going forward, I would think. But I think Patricia's on the call, so I don't know if she wants to. I have raised it with Jenny, but I don't know if Patricia would want to say anything.
Yeah, I'll call Patricia. I'll call you in, but can I just make a point that we are the item 7 discuss not only the integrated care partnership strategy, but how we are going to reshape the Health and Wellbeing Board to address the changes, legal changes coming in on July, and the changes with the new integrated care system. So I think we're doing that, and Sam Crowe is going to go through some suggestions as to how we address that, because we can't just pretend it isn't happening. Patricia, did you want to say a word or two?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think Forbes is right. I just think we need to think a bit more carefully over the next few weeks as to what the shape of the Health and Wellbeing Board will be, and who's the right person to sit as the Vice Chair representing health, particularly because we have discussed on a number of occasions at the Integrated Care Partnership, the Health and Wellbeing Boards being the committee or the group that holds place leaders to account for delivery, and I think we just need to think about, if Jenny was going to sit on the health and wellbeing boards, then where does that leave us with that conversation? Because she can't hold herself to account, if you see what I mean, in terms of the health component of place, and also that she's currently sat as the chair not only of the ICB but also the ICP. So I just think we need to think it through. So what we end up with is the right person in the vice chair seat, and we're also following the principles of good governance.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I'm hoping that Sam's exposition in item 7 will talk about what we're going to do to address the need to reshape this health and wellbeing board in the light of the various changes and of the various changes in society, etc. So, so as far as I'm concerned, is there anybody else who wishes to be put forward to vice chair? If not, I shall say that the sky is. Sorry.
Sorry, Peter. Do you
Yep.
have a seconder for that?
Sorry, can I have a seconder? Sorry, I was.
I'll second, Peter. I'll
Thank
second
you,
the
Spencer.
nomination.
But so that is a valid nomination. Is there anybody else who wishes to be nominated for vice chair, taking into account the points that Patricia has made? No? In that case, the sky is black with hats being thrown in the air. Well done, Forbes. The next item is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest that need to be raised here? No. Fine. That doesn't stop people raising them as we go through the meeting if something occurs that identifies it. Chairman's update. I've very little to say other than we do live in extremely changing times. I'm extremely grateful for the work that Rebecca has done. But the fact is we have statutory duties to provide integration and prevention approaches to improve the health and well-being and reducing inequalities of the population. And I think there's been some excellent work in terms of prevention at scale, but integration is something we now need to concentrate on moving forward, or we need to address in a much greater way. And I think the point raised by Patricia that we may need to think of the membership of the board, we may need to think about the relationship between this board and the ICS. We need to understand who or what is the place-based accountable officer, and we need to sort of make sure that we move forward with a better care fund and that doesn't drop off the end. So I'm keen that we move forward. I would also add that we've got a situation where we need to think about how we address our business as we move forward in the light of the legislation coming forward in July and the requirements to work more effectively with the ICS, or to work effectively with the ICS. And for that reason, Sam is about to suggest 2 separate development sessions. And I've had some discussions with Sam, but that doesn't mean to say that these can't be shaped by this particular committee, of course. And it's certainly, I approve and welcome the idea that we have one development session with the BCP Health and Wellbeing Board to ensure that we are both working along the same track, because it would be inappropriate for us to start operating on a different trajectory from BCP, and then perhaps a second development session where we spend some time thinking about what it is we as a health and wellbeing board for Dorset Council are going to do, say, and operate. So I'm looking forward to Sam's item under 7, and that was the only thing I wanted to raise under Chairman's announcements or Chairman's update. So I'm going to stop there on that. Public participation, we have none, which is item 5. Councillor questions, we have none, which is item 6. So I'm going to move over to you now, Sam, if that's okay, where you're going to talk about the Integrated Care Partnership Strategy update and your ideas for a development session. Are you okay with that, Sam?
Yes, thank you, Chair. That'll be fine. And I think the point of the discussion today is there is a short report which you'll have seen at agenda item 7, which updates the board members on the progress that we've made in starting to develop the Integrated Care Partnership Strategy. There are 2 recommendations on that paper. So what I'll do is I'll speak briefly to the paper, and then perhaps we'll move to the recommendations. And then I think following Peter's chair's update, the more helpful conversation is, I haven't worked this out, by the way. Today is really the start of consulting with the board. to start to think through how we take full advantage of the statutory roles and responsibilities of the Health and Wellbeing Board, recognising that the rest of the landscape is changing. There's tremendous opportunity, but there is also, as ever, the risk of duplication with an integrated care partnership launching as well. So it's really, I'm happy to broker that conversation, Chair, and to provide some points for discussion, because I've got some ideas, but as ever, it's always valuable to hear from other board members about how you see the world as well. So if the Chair's happy, I'll just take us briefly through the paper. We'll revisit the recommendations and then we'll open it up to a broader discussion.
Yes, please, Sam. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So I think at our last meeting on the 30th of March, you'll have seen a presentation that I gave, which was very initial thoughts about the principles and the way that we wanted to develop the integrated care partnership strategy in a very different way to the way that we've built some of our health and care strategies previously. And I think at the time there was a strong sense that we wanted to break from the tradition of perhaps mirroring the national guidance and the requirements and then going out to consult, and actually to do this in a way that we take a bit more time. We build almost like a continuous engagement process into the development of the strategy. And so that was set out in a short presentation. The paper that you have with you today just walks through and sort of underpins that approach and provides members with a brief update against the 3 work streams. So just for members' memory, we're required to produce the strategy by December 2022. The Health and Wellbeing Boards do have a statutory role in approving what's in the Integrated Care Partnership Strategy. And then we set in a chain of events that will see the Integrated Care Board starting to then develop its 5-year plan in the light of what the ICP strategy is saying. And then all of the other organisations that comprise the integrated care system will also have to show due regard to what's in the integrated care partnership strategy. The point I'd make is that that also includes councils as equal partners in the integrated care system. So there's a real opportunity for us to set the ambition fairly high as we develop the integrated care partnership strategy. But equally, one of the challenges is to make sure that the strategy is specific enough that it's providing some really clear signals and pointers as to what we want to do better as a system, and not remain too long-term focused and too sort of high level that it doesn't provide meaningful challenge back to our partners and our organisations. So the approach that we decided on was to really work around 3 work streams. The research and the insights work stream is perhaps easiest to understand, and it connects with the Health and Wellbeing Board's existing statutory roles around joint strategic needs assessment. So under the legislation, each Health and Wellbeing Board is required by law to prepare a joint strategic needs assessment. And that's the process that we use to identify priorities that should go forward into a joint health and wellbeing strategy. But also, I would expect the guidance that comes out in July on preparation of the integrated care partnership strategies to make a very, very strong link between the JSNA in each area and priorities for the overarching ICP strategy. So that, to some extent, is the more straightforward part of strategy development. We use a range of data sources and population health insights to gain a good understanding as to the outcomes and the inequalities where we want to make more of a difference. And in the second work stream, we're intending to supplement that with an engagement insight work stream, which will surface the results of conversations with the public, service users and our employees from different parts of the system to sort of test, as it were, how the system can support people to live healthier for longer and to live more independently without recourse to services. So those 2 elements, I think, will provide the bulk of the evidence that we need to write the strategy. The final bit of the work stream has been what I've called systems leadership, which is really the engagement and the ownership development around the strategy. So over the past 2 or 3 months, I've been going to a number of boards and system leadership meetings, essentially saying, this is how we're intending to build the strategy. This is what we think is going to be important. Is there anything missing? Are you comfortable with that approach? But above all, how can we also continue to connect with your organisation or the members that you represent to make sure that we're continually checking in and testing what we're saying in the strategy before we end up with hopefully a draft in September, and then further time to do more engagement before we sign off in December. So the paper walks us through that. I'm really pleased with the progress that we've been making. We're at a sort of fairly critical point now, just before the summer, where the first development session that Peter mentioned as chair, we've now got a date. It's going to be on the 25th of July. It'll be in the afternoon. It'll be a hybrid meeting, so hopefully a combination of physical, in-person event with the ability for the wider board membership to join online. And at that event, we will go through an initial assessment of the priorities from the JSNA, but we're going to do that in a way that doesn't overwhelm members with a whole load of information. What we're going to do is to bring that to life, and we're going to use 3 or 4 case studies that show the way that a system could be functioning far more effectively if we're getting integration right along 3 of the pathways. So we'll choose one that represents some of the issues that children and young people face. We'll be looking at an issue affecting working age adults, and we'll also pick a pathway that's important for older people as well. In terms of the engagement progress, Kirsty Hillier, who's been leading that particular piece of work, is planning to train a number of people from the system to be interviewers. And the point of the work is really to have deep conversations with a range of people who wouldn't normally come forward. So in previous groups where we ask for engagement or consultation, we have a number of people that obviously support those groups on a regular basis. But this is really about reaching a bit further into parts of Dorset that perhaps we don't ordinarily visit. And in addition to that, there'll be opportunities to do face-to-face conversations around some of the priorities in the strategy through the summer. We're going to surface the insights from that work fairly quickly. So every 10 interviews, we'll put the main themes up and use a digital engagement platform to widen the conversation. We're also very, very mindful that not everyone's necessarily comfortable interacting using digital engagement platforms. So, as I said, we will also endeavour to take the early insights from that approach and to share that with other networks who are doing face-to-face engagement in our communities. I would say under paragraph 2.8, just worthwhile looking at the range of leadership engagement meetings that we've conducted over the past 2 or 3 months. There's been a huge variety. If I think back to previous iterations of strategy development, I think we're doing a better job this time around of actually getting around the main integrated care partners. But as ever, there's always more that we can do. So I'm always open if you feel that you haven't had enough of a session on the strategy development. My email is on the paper. I'm always receptive to people contacting me, and we'll do our best to try to get around and talk to the main groups in our system about the strategy development process. From this engagement process, we are then going to start to think about building the strategy essentially in 3 layers. There will be parts of the strategy that talk about the outcomes and the gaps where we feel that it would be helpful for our system to provide more focus, to shift the dial on some of those outcomes that haven't moved. Inequalities will be a huge piece of that jigsaw. The situation in Dorset is usually we don't stand out particularly on national health measures when you compare us to other council areas or other parts of England. But the way that we do stand out very often is the variation within our council area, and that equally applies to the PCP council area. So variation in causes of ill health, the number of people living with diseases, long-term conditions and disability, and premature mortality is what we really need to get into if we're going to make a difference. So variation is very much a heart of our story. The second part will be a focus on integration. So if we're getting integration right, if we're getting the benefits of being an integrated care system right, how could we transform some of those health and care pathway opportunities? What would that look like? Starting to provide some signals into how we might think differently around commissioning. Above all, managing to think about moving resources more closely to where we have variations in needs, and providing some insights into how we can look to really improve the quality, the experience and the access to health and care services which our residents deserve. And then finally, there's a placeholder on transformation opportunities. This is really talking about some of the enabling work that needs to happen in our integrated care system if we're going to continue to meet the challenging pressures that we see at the moment. So what can we do through shifting more care on services using digital means? How can we think differently about models of care, perhaps involving a wider range of partners? How do we strengthen that relationship with voluntary, community and social enterprise organisations, and to perhaps put more support and care at an earlier stage around people and communities to support their resilience? And how do we start to make inroads into the challenge around workforce, which is one that's affecting most of our organisations, I'm sure, at the moment. And then just in terms of the timeline, as I've mentioned, we'd hope to get a draft strategy in circulation during early September and provide another round of engagement against what we're saying in that draft strategy until sign off in December. But I'll make the point again that I made in March. This is not likely to be a single one-off strategy development process. This will be subject to annual review, and I imagine will almost be in continual strategy development as we start to get into the exciting part of the strategy, which is what are we going to do about it? That discovery and delivery process has to be an ongoing live conversation, not just between organisations that make up the integrated care system, but above all, putting people and communities at the heart of those discussions, and hopefully surfacing solutions that will start to address some of the challenges that we see. So I think that's probably all I wanted to say by way of introduction, Chair. And the two recommendations that we're seeking agreement on today is that the board supports the update on the approach and the development to the ICP strategy, and to support the proposed joint development session in July, which we've already mentioned. The first one with BCP Council, and then we can break into a discussion about the second development session, if that's helpful.
And thank you very much, Sam. That was, as always, an extremely erudite exposition of that. The second session would be a different date, just to be quite clear. It would, yeah. So, would members like to put on the chat if they want to say if they put RTS? Patricia, you've come on screen, so I suspect that's your way of saying you'd like to speak.
You read my mind, Peter.
I did.
I can follow the instructions around turning the camera off to say broadband. So yeah, when I switch it on, use it because I'm about to click the hand button. So I'm really excited about this piece of work. I think we have an opportunity to make a significant positive difference to our communities in terms of the quality of life, and I think Sam's doing a great job leading it. So that's my first point. I think in the national timetable, yes, we've got to produce the strategy by December, but there is an acknowledgement by both the Secretary of State for Health and local government that this will probably be a first draft. What will come in October is some guidelines for the NHS only about multi-year planning, which we are grateful for, given that we never get anything beyond a year, which makes long-term investment really difficult. So that gives us a chance to start to think through what the ICB contribution, as in health partners, needs to be to the strategy, and really get that down in some detail, ready for submission in April. I think there are some things that we just need to think through to make sure that even in the high-level strategic document, that we are doing what we need to do in health to contribute to the health inequalities piece and through the social and economic development. So there are some things I think we just need to be clear about in terms of the what, in that, yes, our first obligation is to fulfil the constitutional standards which ministers will expect, but I want us to think about that through the health and equalities lens. So as we start to recover services and bring weights down, we're doing that in a way that, one, certainly doesn't exacerbate health inequalities, but starts to make some inroads into them in the way that we're working, both in terms of outcome, access, and location of service. And then there's something for us at the ICB around how we really live up to the commitment around reducing wider inequalities and be clear what health is doing in partnership with local government and other partners around that social and economic development piece. And Jenny and I have talked a lot about what the board agenda needs to be at the ICB so that we're not losing focus on the latter, which actually for us is the most important bit of the NHS agenda. It's not really the productivity and access bit, because we should be doing that anyway. That should be business as usual. And then I think we just need to think through the how. And Sam and I have talked about, workplace, where the provider collaboratives come into this, how we use our finances flexibly across health and local government to get the best use out of the Dorset pound, making sure that what we do is always outcome based and not process based, and the centre are coming round to the fact that when they produce the next iteration of the long-term plan, it will be outcome focused, not process driven, but also that co-production, citizenship and asset-based development need to be at the heart of the way that we're working going forward. So I think we've got, through the ICP, we've got a fantastic opportunity to build a much stronger partnership that will be the foundation of the delivery of this new strategy, provided that we can all make sure that we share a single purpose and we're clear what each other's roles are in the delivery.
Thank you, Patricia. Very, very equally eloquent. And can I particularly agree with your emphasis on outcome based, because it's really important that we get something working together and then we take real decisions that move us forward, because we need to avoid concentrating on discussing data but not actually doing anything with it. We need to have some outcomes that actually meet the requirements, our statutory requirements, and I absolutely get your passion for it. So and as chair, I will be in some ways refocusing on outcome based as we move forward over the next year, and this just gives us a great opportunity to do so.
It does, and I think the only other point that I would make, Peter, is that I absolutely understand Sam's comparison with other systems, because we're all compared in league tables all the time. But I actually think the really valid comparison is yourself with yourself, and knowing that you're moving in the right direction. So I want us to be as ambitious as we can without setting ourselves up to fail, but be as ambitious as we can in terms of the objectives that we set ourselves over the first 5 years.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. So to some extent, what we're doing today is we're not getting into the detail, but we're setting out a plan for moving forward, and we're looking for everybody in this meeting to buy into that with the passion that Patricia's shown. I'm looking at the chat line and seeing if anybody else wants to say RTS and add any thoughts. I'm going to take that as just massive agreement. The other thing I would add is that as a matter of interest, we are producing what you might call our 5-year strategy for Dorset Council. We're going a rather similar timescale, which I agreed at Cabinet yesterday, in order to try and make sure that we have a clear understanding of what it is we're doing, why we're doing it, etc., and it fits in with the ICS. Forbes, you have put RTS up. You are very welcome. Come on in.
Yeah, thank you. It's really, of course, I fully support all that's been said. I suppose what I'd like us to start thinking about is at what stage do we think we're going to get to an operational delivery model for this that properly connects health, both general practice and our community providers, particularly now the hospital model, and our local authority providers. Because actually, what we're talking about is here and now in Dorset. We're all struggling with performance issues. I'll reflect, I spent a long time on the telephone this morning with an individual who is contacting our practice very significantly at the moment, but the primary problem is homelessness, but have escalating both physical and mental health needs. And we need a health and wellbeing board, or a construct of a health and wellbeing board, that can actually better address those needs at place. As a GP, And as colleague GPs, we are very interested in working at neighbourhood and what we can best deliver at place. The place being for Dorset County, the Dorset Council footprint, and we know that. So it needn't necessarily be the same between East and West, but we have to get to a stage where we're actually agreeing what that might look like. It's a recurring theme, particularly in conversations I'm involved in and conversation with colleagues, and I just wonder, so we have the strategy and we absolutely support that. It's then about how what's the mechanism and the governance for implementation of that.
Absolutely. And Sam, did you, I mean, I think in the first and the second session, we need to really make sure that every time we talk about things, we have the end game in sight in terms of operational implementation. Are you happy with that general approach, Sam?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's why when we go into the Health and Wellbeing Board development sessions, I hope it's not going to be a dry run through of population health data. It's actually going to be case studies that show some of the challenges at different points along the pathway. And just to be clear, the pathway doesn't start with health and care services. The pathway starts with people and families. So there, in terms of the question about the operating model, I'll just give a view very quickly, then Patricia may want to come in. I think we've had this conversation as we've gone through the system leadership engagement around strategy development, and I've been quite careful to try to put a bit of a boundary between what we say in the strategy and then the next stage, which very much is the discovery and the delivery of how we can take full advantage of some of the freedoms and the flexibilities that are coming in. But I'm very, very mindful that there is a tension between how people are feeling and the things that are going on the front line and the pressures that people are under with what we're saying in a strategy, which essentially has to be medium to long term. We've got to find a connection between the two, and that's why the engagement and the insight work with not only our people and our residents is really important, but also employees working in frontline roles. So we are doing our best to get around and talk to those teams, because we're going to have to double run this. There's no other way of doing it. There are going to be some things that we have to do differently over a fairly long period of time if we're going to have the impact at scale to really change the dial on some of these outcomes. But essentially, how we solve getting more support earlier in the the particular instance, no matter what it is, we have to start to sort of rebuild our system, if you like, to be able to put more support directly towards people and families at an earlier stage and support that resilience before things escalate and then we're managing crisis after crisis. I know everyone knows that, but the conversation about how we do that in a planned and purposeful way at scale is really, really important. So I don't want to influence that or bias that. The strategy, I think, sets the what.
The operating model needs to be, and finalising the governance arrangements that wrap around it, because what we've got now, I think, is a temporary holding position as opposed to something that we'll all be comfortable with going forward. So I would expect all that work to be finished by the end of March, which plays very nicely into the financial year and the setting of objectives and creating programme teams to actually do stuff. So that's the timetable that I've got in my head at the moment.
Oh, thank you, Patricia. That's very helpful. And if we can have that timetable, in our back pockets to feed into it. Forbes, did you want to come back in, or is that RTS from what it was originally?
No, that was from what it was originally. Okay. It's helpful to have that feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? That's fine. I don't think we need to boil the ocean, because I think we need to recognise that we're in some senses, if not restarting, we're reshaping in the light of events, and this is a really fantastic opportunity to reshape in the light of legislative changes, Patricia Miller and the ICS moving forward and shaping their organisation, local government reshaping, and a variety of other occurrences. Sam, I'm not going to hold this open for too much longer. Is there anything you want to add before you perhaps summarise the recommendations that you've got in your report?
Probably not to the report itself, but what I would like is a bit of a conversation with board members about the proposed content of the joint development session on the 25th. So if you want to take the recommendations, then we can move on to a broader discussion, because there's quite a few questions that are swirling around.
Right. Okay, let's do that, because I think that makes sense. So the first thing is to establish that we're agreeing the principle of what Sam is presenting. Can I do this by exception rather than going around individual? If anybody disagrees, can you put in the chat line disagree? Okay. I can see nothing in the chat line, so I am going to take, from a governor's point of view, that this has been approved by everybody. Please don't come back later and say you didn't approve it, because you have to put something in the chat line if there's any issues. No? In that case, can we take that as approved, Sam? And can we move on to the structure and content of the development session?
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, everybody, for supporting that. So what we're aiming to do in the joint development session with the BCP Council Health and Wellbeing Board is, first of all, consider the guidance that we're hoping will be issued in July. I don't know what will be in the guidance, but when the legislation was passed to lay the foundations for integrated care systems, with all of the new structures that we have, including the Integrated Care Partnership, there's a need to reassess the role of the Health and Wellbeing Board, because they continue to have those statutory responsibilities. So they remain statutory boards. Their original purpose was to promote prevention and integration, as Peter pointed out in his chair's address. And I think they still have a really powerful potential role in being the strategic place boards, effectively, to oversee and to do some holding to account. So if we've got an integrated care partnership strategy where we're setting some ambition, we do need a conversation about how the boards will function, given that they're signing off on that ICP strategy. But which bit are they holding us to account for? Is it delivery around the Dorset Council Place and the BCP Council Place? There's some questions around exactly how that will work. I think the other issue that's interesting is the direction of travel is very clearly towards starting to think about devolving some budgets down to place level, but that won't happen immediately. So I think there's going to be the need for a statutory committee, which will be a subcommittee of the Integrated Care Board. And so one of the questions is, does the Health and Wellbeing Board have a relationship with that subcommittee? And if so, what is that relationship and how are they going to work? One of the other questions is that the guidance has talked about place-based accountable officers. That was proposed in the guidance without a huge amount of detail. I think my view is we've got some flexibility in how we think about those roles, and we've got a bit of time to work through that. But again, thinking about who that person is and where they sit, are they connected with the Health and Wellbeing Board, or are they connected with the place-based committee, are all questions that I think would be helpful to spend some time discussing as two Health and Wellbeing Boards. But above all, the most important thing is, what do we really care about in our places? That's where I think Health and Wellbeing Boards can be really powerful. And that's the value of the conversation and bringing all of the partners together, is to run through our assessment of what we think is important in each of those places, and to articulate that in a really strong and clear way that it can be picked up by the ICP strategy and the partners who will then be expected to think about delivery against that. So we're going to do the session in two parts. The first part will be looking at the existing guidance. It will be looking at the guidance that comes out in July, and we've got a chance to have a conversation about how we want to function as a board. I know that, Peter, you had some thoughts about the future membership of the Health and Wellbeing Board, and I think that would be a good conversation to have. And above all, in my mind, it's going to be quite a potentially crowded space when we get past the 1st of July. So we have to really keep our eyes fairly sharply focused on how we get the best out of everyone and avoid duplication. So what goes to the Integrated Care Partnership Forum, what remains held by the Health and Wellbeing Boards, And above all, how do we retain an element of independence and challenge, respectful challenge, I think, in the Health and Wellbeing boards, so that we get the best out of the system. Part 2, I think, is more straightforward, and that's going to be the discussion of the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment priorities and those health and care pathway opportunities and transformation opportunities that we will be highlighting through the Health and Wellbeing boards to go forward into the ICP strategy. But as I said before, it's not going to be slide after slide of public health data. It'll be case studies. Hopefully we'll tell those in a compelling way, and that will give a very clear understanding, if you like, of how we could improve if we were really getting integration and prevention right at scale. So happy to pause there and open up for further thoughts and discussion, if that's useful, Chair.
It is, and I thank you very much for that. Sorry, I've moved off my earphones, so if it's a bit tinny, that's why. Can I make 2 suggestions? One is, I think that was a really useful description of some of the issues that we need to be discussing. And it was interesting that Forbes Watson right at the beginning talked about the membership in a way that you and I had talked about it. I think we have to be honest about what's an appropriate membership that can add value and that isn't unnecessarily large, but can actually incorporate all of the appropriate bodies that need to be there. So that's point 1 I want to make. And the second is, I think it would be helpful, Sam, if you could construct a list of questions, not answers, but questions people might like to ask themselves prior to the development day, and then people can think about those, and they can either come to the development day with some answers, or they can actually jot some answers down and send it to George Dare, our democratic officer, who will distribute them, and that they can just be starters for 10. So if people don't mind doing that, and my reason for that is, if you wait until the day to come with a really brilliant point, it means that people don't have a chance to reflect on it and think about how they can put it in. So I'm very keen and very excited about the way we're moving forward. Forbes, you came back on screen. So, Sam, do you want to come back?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. If I could just amend that second action a little bit, it would be good if the questions came from a range of board members as well. So I'm happy to hold the ring on that and collate them. So equally, if you've got ideas that you feel are not clear enough yet, let's pull them together and we can start to work up some questions in advance of the session.
Okay, so George, there's an action on everybody here to think about questions that they would like and to submit them to Sam beforehand. You don't have to, but it's really helpful if you do. They don't have to be particularly well thought out, but they have to be relevant. So we have silence, and I'm assuming that my machine hasn't stopped. Yeah, because it does sometimes happen. Is there anybody else want to make any comments, or are we in agreement with right? We've got Forbes and then Patricia and Simon.
So I'm fully in agreement, and I welcome the opportunity for the time to be spent doing this, and I think it'd be quite good to try and get to the end of the workshop with some actions and not just to have another workshop. I think that's quite important. Back to Patricia's sort of general timeline, that we actually are starting to move this forward. We have spent a few months sort of throwing this around, haven't we? And it'd be quite nice to actually move towards some tangibles where we can.
Forbes, you will not get any stronger agreement from me. I'm so in agreement with that, because we really do need to get tangible, positive, clear actions with deliverables. We need to understand what good looks like so that we know when we've got there and how we're moving along. Patricia.
Actually, you let Simon go first, and then I'll come at the end, because I'm interested to see what Simon's got to say.
Simon, we're all interested, but go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. It was just a question to clarify. When we talk about the membership of the Health and Wellbeing Board, the membership is presumably driven by its mandate and its accountabilities and what it's actually going to try and do. So, to my mind, it would be helpful to, first of all, work out exactly what the Health and Wellbeing Board scope, etc. is, and what it's all about, then have a break of some description, and then say, in the light of what we've got to achieve, who is it best to have as a member and the membership? So that might be, Sam, what's being planned, but it was just to clarify how you were thinking about that. And my second point, while I've got the mic, if I may, is just to say, although you didn't ask for support in the earlier vote, very much endorsed and support what was being put forward. And thank you.
Simon, thank you very much. And that certainly was the intention, that it would be of that format. Patricia, did you want to come in and add anything to what Simon has just said?
I think Simon's right, partly in the membership partly needs to be driven by the accountability set out in the statute, but I also think we need to think about the membership of Health and Wellbeing Board in a broader sense, particularly if we're going to ask them, the two, to hold place leaders to account. So I think we just need to try and a way of aligning the two. I was thinking about the request for questions that might need to be answered in the workshop, and one of the questions I think that's burning for me is, when we think about Michael Marmot's view of proportionate universalism and how we might assess the needs of our population in different neighbourhoods in order to make sure that the service umbrella that we put together is able to meet the needs. And that may mean reducing service umbrella in some areas and increasing it in others if we accept that sliding scale. I think there's something for us to talk about at the workshop about how we create a narrative around that, particularly when we start the conversations with the community about, this is what you've said you want, but actually we think on that scale, this is what you need. How do we start to think about the narrative that we all will use that needs to be common and aligned to responding to that? Because obviously, as councillors, you're not elected on the basis that you'll agree to give resource to another neighbourhood. So we need to think about how we create a narrative that everybody's comfortable with.
Yeah, I think there will be, let's just be honest to there'll be tensions and there'll be disagreements, but yeah, let's at least understand, let's agree what we're disagreeing about, and let's work together rather than be uncertain as to what we're doing. So I'm absolutely, Sam, I completely get this requirement to spend some time thinking about what the membership should be to reflect A, the statutory requirements, but B, those people or organisations that we need to be able to hold to account for delivery of the plans that we identify. Is that right, or is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's right, and it'd be helpful just to spend time working out how we avoid, I guess, role confusion is the simplest way of explaining that, isn't it? My personal view is I don't think that the guidance was necessarily helpful in considering the role of health and wellbeing boards. So what we don't want is to have to retrofit something just because we have to have it. We need to start with the purpose. We need to start with a focus on understanding the outcomes, and then put the rest of the bits of the system back together, if you like, in a way that makes most sense and is going to deliver in the the quickest and the most efficient way possible. So starting with that clarity of purpose is really, really important, and I'm confident that we can find a way through. But that's why the discussion is really, really helpful. And I think Patricia's question is a great one, isn't it? Because the NHS has got a long tradition of fairness, but what we're talking about here is equity, not necessarily fairness, as a lot of people will understand it.
Yeah.
So how do we, lift up some groups, because there's a recognition that if we don't help them, early enough, it's just going to lead to, even more poorer outcomes and an impact on them and their families. So having a really good discussion about that in the boards, and having our leaders in the system able to talk about that quite passionately and to represent why it's important, not just for individuals, but for the health of our system, is going to be really, really powerful. So I look forward to the questions.
Right. Thank you. I look forward to people's, it doesn't need to be a question. It can be a comment or just an area of, I'm a bit confused about this, or I think this needs to be addressed. And you don't need to have a solution, although it is helpful, but it would be useful to have those things that are a stone in your shoe, metaphorically. Does anybody else wish to add anything? Sam, I'm really grateful for what you've done and what you've prepared. As always, it's really high quality. I'm very grateful. Sam, if we're agreed on where we're going, yeah, Sam, come on in. What, as far as I'm concerned, I think we're there. Yeah.
One final question just about how we run the session on the 25th. We do have, as you'd expect, a slide deck that does summarise what we're saying about the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment under each council area. I'm more than happy to provide that in advance as a sort of background briefing deck. But are you happy with the intended approach of not overwhelming people on the day with a lot of data, but focusing on the case study approach to bring the challenge to life?
I am personally very, very happy about that, because we need to stick at a reasonably high level in terms of the initial strategic identification, and we need to make sure we don't get bogged down, you know, paralysis by analysis. But if anybody else disagrees, they need to say. But if not, case studies that demonstrate the generic issues, I think, are much more powerful.
Fabulous, thank you. It's really helpful.
It's just typing away, I can see it.
I'm making my notes online.
I thought you were.
Yeah.
Right. I think we've agreed Sam's paper. We've agreed the need for the first of 2 sessions. We've agreed the style, the sense and the modus operandi of it. And we're agreed that we do need to reshape and treat this as an opportunity to perhaps think about how we might do things slightly differently. Does anybody have any final comments before I close the meeting? Sam, is there anything final you want to say?
No, I've had quite a lot of airtime. Thank you, Chair. It's been really helpful.
Right, and Patricia, you've had quite a lot of airtime, so you could make a comment, or we can say thank you for everything, and we look forward to seeing you later.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, and can I thank everybody who's attended? You've all been quiet, but I'm suspecting that's because you are in agreement. If there's anything that you're not in agreement, you know, you do need to say so now. But I'm taking this as agreement with both the approach and the methodology.
There's just a little note in the chat, Peter, from George.
Right, I've just missed that. Right, sorry, George is quite right, thank you. Urgent items, there are none. Exempt business, there are none. I therefore declare the meeting closed. Thank you, George, that was very good of you. For those of you who don't know, I'm struggling a bit because I've just tested positive for COVID for the 2nd time. So I'm quite depressed at the moment, but I've put my very best positive hat on. Thank you very much. I'll say cheerio to all of you. Thank you very much for coming. Look forward